once lost yourself. At times, the dream life will repeat this symbolism to confirm what waking consciousness still questions. You dream of a staircase in an old house. The lower floor is lit and noisy. You hear familiar voices calling upward, some affectionate, some irritated, some pleading. You are not trapped. You are standing on the landing with one hand on the rail. Behind you, there is another room, quiet, almost empty, with a chair by a window. The dream's pressure eye, subtle. The old voices assume you will come down, but in the dream you turn, not dramatically, and go into the quiet room. You sit in the chair. When you wake, there may be grief in the chest, but there is also a strange solidity. The dream is showing you a psychic fact already in place. The center of gravity has moved upward and inward. The lower floor has not disappeared, but it is no longer shadow integrated as structure sovereign. You may ask inwardly, if not aloud, why this movement feels so irreversible. Why can one no longer simply be understanding in the old way and keep the peace? The answer lies in the relation between consciousness and symbol. Once an unconscious pattern has become symbolically visible. Once you have seen the corridor, the sealed letter, the broken key, the staircase, the closed rooms, your participation in that pattern changes in kind. You may still enact fragments of it, but you can no longer do so innocently. The psyche now experiences regression as conscious falsification. This is why re-entering old roles feels not only tiring but degrading. It is not because the role was evil. It is because you now know what it costs and what it conceals. In this phase, music, another recurring symbol, often appears the mirror, but not as vanity. It may come in waking life as a brief perception. You pass a mirror and notice your face is quieter than before, less arranged, less explanatory. Or it may appear in a dream. You stand before a mirror in a dim room, and at first the glass shows nothing, only winter light. Then your face appears, but older in expression, not in age. There is no drama in it, no accusation, no smile, only a face that is no longer asking permission to exist. This image can disturb the ego, because it does not confirm the old moral identity. It does not look good in the sentimental sense. It looks exact. The mirror in this stage reflects not your mood but your reorganization. It reveals a person who is no longer governed, music, by the need to be recognized as harmless. That too is part of the shadow's integration. Many psychologically adaptive people build a life around being impossible to accuse. They become preemptively reasonable, preemptively soft, preemptively transparent. This is not hypocrisy. It is protection. If one has known environments where accusation carried danger, one learns to stay ahead of it through our clarity and emotional service. But this creates a profound vulnerability. Your conscience can be externally manipulated through image threat. Others need not understand you. They need only imply that you have been unfair, and the old machinery begins at once. In the Sophia stage, this vulnerability narrows not because conscience disappears, but because image and conscience separate. You no longer mistake being misunderstood for being guilty. This is one of the points at which others may become genuinely alarmed, especially those who unconsciously relied on your guilt access. Their familiar methods no longer yield the previous movement in you. They sharpen the moral language. They invoke your history. They invoke what you used to be. They may even praise your empathy in order to reactivate it. This produces a very specific atmosphere, a strange politeness with pressure underneath. As though the conversation were standing on a hidden trapdoor, you feel it immediately. You hear not only the words, but the old contract attempting to reconstitute itself. In earlier phases of life, your psychological skill often expressed itself as interpretation. You could tell who was wounded, who was citing from fear, who was split off from their own shame, who was unconsciously repeating a family pattern. That capacity does not disappear. What changes is what you do with it. You no longer automatically convert understanding into accommodation. This is one of the defining marks of integration, and one of the reasons it is so disturbing to others. They were accustomed to your insight as service. Now your insight remains with you as knowledge. It no longer functions as free labor in the relational field. This can create an uncanny social response. People may feel seen by you and simultaneously abandoned by you. They sense your understanding has not diminished, which makes your non-participation more difficult for them to bear. If you were merely cold, they could dismiss you. If you were merely angry, they could wait for the weather to pass. But when you are precise, calm and no longer available for the old emotional economy. They experience a form of psychological mirror. Their strategies become visible to themselves through their failure. This is why some become hostile. The hostility is often a defense against self-recognition. There is no need here to moralize against them. Many of these patterns are inherited, unconscious, and widely shared. People use each other's structures because they do not know their own. They seek regulation where they can find it. They repeat what once stabilized them. But individuation has a ruthless dimension. It interrupts forms of mutual adaptation that depend on self-betrayal. What once looked like harmony is exposed as management. What once looked like closeness is music, exposed as access. What once looked like your virtue is exposed in part as your survival form. And so music, the emotional temperature of your life, changes. It does not become warm in the conventional way. It becomes clear. Clarity can feel cold because it stops feeding ambiguity. You begin to experience long stretches without the old agitation. Music, in those stretches, grief may surface. Not only grief for what others did, but grief for how long your own life was organized around being entered. This grief is not a call to restore the former arrangement. It is the mourning that accompanies reclassification. You are not only losing people on roles and expectations, you are losing a moral image of yourself that was built around availability. The psyche often marks this mourning through ordinary domestic details. You put a cup down in the kitchen and notice the silence is not empty. You sit in a chair in late afternoon and feel no need to send the message you once would have sent. You hear your phone in another room and do not rise. The light on the wall shifts toward evening. Nothing happens, yet inwardly an epic is ending. These moments matter because they are where integration leaves the abstract and becomes lived time. The old compulsion used to govern these exact intervals. Now the intervals belong to you. If one were to name the mechanism beneath all this in Jungian terms, one would say that the axis of organization the Sophia Stage explained is shifting from persona complex adaptation toward relation with the self. But this sentence is too clean unless one also says what it feels like. It feels like losing appetite for what once kept you socially coherent. It feels like becoming unreadable to those who only knew your functions. It feels like a house in which certain doors are now permanently closed, not locked in anger, simply no longer built for passage. It feels like standing before an old mirror and recognizing that the person looking back is not more defended but less divisible. The social world seldom forgives a change it did not witness being earned. It can tolerate your suffering because suffering confirms continuity. It knows how to place you when you are still legible through pain. Music, it can even tolerate your temporary anger because anger still binds you to the field and promises a later return to the old arrangement. What it cannot easily tolerate is your quiet reclassification of what is no longer yours to carry. There is no spectacle in this, and therefore no ceremony by which others can admit what has changed. They continue to approach you by habit. They continue to speak to the former architecture. They continue to test the old doors. This is where the phenomenon becomes almost clinical in its precision. One person will try concern, another will try urgency, another will try nostalgia, another will try the moral language of fairness, another will try injury, another will try admiration. In earlier years, these entrances did not appear to you as entrances. They appeared as reality itself. You believed each emotional atmosphere as it arrived. You felt responsible for what was stirra. In others by your delay, your boundary, your silence, your refusal to decode and rescue. But now the sequence is visible. You can watch the attempts pass through their order. This visibility is one of the signatures of the Sophia Stage. The pattern does not merely hurt less. It becomes readable as pattern. At this point, music, many people around you begin to experience you as different in ways they cannot describe. They may say you feel distant, but what they mean is that they can no longer move your interior with the same instruments. They may say you are colder, but what they mean is that your emotional field is no longer externally governed. They may say you have become private, secrecy, withholding, whose accusations often arise in those who once mistook access for intimacy. To them, your opacity now feels like removal of love because they do not know another form of relation than penetration. They cannot yet imagine a bond that does not require immediate entry. A mature psychology must be exact here. You are not becoming invulnerable. You are becoming less accessible to misuse. This distinction matters because the ego, when threatened, likes grand interpretations. This is to say, I need no one. I am beyond this. I have outgrown them all. Such thoughts are often a compensatory inflation, and if followed, they lead to sterility. The actual movement is more restrained. You still feel, you still register longing, disappointment, tenderness, grief, but these no longer compel self-abandonment. The emotion remains yours while it moves. It does not instantly become a corridor through which someone else enters. This is one of the deepest consequences of integration. Effect returns to ownership. If we speak in Jungian terms, one could say the transference field is changing. You no longer unconsciously offer yourself as the symbolic parent, confessor, regulator, redeemer, or witness in quite the same automatic way. Others still attempt to place you in these roles because psychic systems seek continuity, but the fit fails. The old transferential hooks strike a surface that is no longer organized around them. This creates a peculiar discomfort in the relational space. The other person may become more dramatic or more delicate, alternating between aggression and carefulness, because they sense both your perception and your non-compliance. They feel watched by a son who is no longer available to be arranged. There is often one relationship in which this becomes unmistakable, and in that relationship a single conversation that reveals the entire mechanism. Not because the words are extraordinary, but because the timing is exact. A message comes late, after distance, after prior disregard, after some event in their life has produced pressure. The tone carries a blend of familiarity and need. Perhaps they mention your silence. Perhaps they imply hurt. Perhaps they speak in a way that assumes your emotional attention is already theirs. You read, music, it, and feel almost simultaneously two realities. One is the old pathway still intact as memory. The other is the new fact, which is that the pathway no longer activates movement. You do not become cruel. You do not become righteous. You simply do not enter. This not entering is the completed event. The ordinary mind calls this detachment. The deeper psyche knows it as the end of unconscious contract. An unconscious contract is not written in words. It is composed of repeated exchanges, emotional timing, assumed duties, and compensatory roles. It says without saying, I will remain available to your disorder if I can preserve belonging. I will absorb what is unprocessed in you if I can maintain moral position. I will translate your contradictions if I can avoid your withdrawal. Such contracts are often mutual but not symmetrical. In your case, the asymmetry may have been hidden by your talent because you were able to carry more. Others assumed you should. Capacity became obligation. Sensitivity became assigned function. Conscience became an access point. When the Sophia Stage opens, this contract is not renegotiated. It is exposed. And exposure itself destroys it. Music, one cannot unknow the price after seeing the structure. The persona that upheld the agreement, the one who interpreted, softened, and remained perpetually interruptible, losses symbolic authority. The ego may still imitate it from habit, but the psyche no longer supports the imitation for long. This creates a period in which you may appear inconsistent to others. Sometimes you answer, sometimes you fall silent. Sometimes you remain warm but inaccessible. Sometimes you are present in body but no longer performing your old role. Others, what has quietly completed inside you, read this as instability. In truth, you are observing the last friction between habit and reorganization. This friction often produces dreams of thresholds. The unconscious, when a major reclassification is occurring, returns repeatedly to doorways, corridors, music, windows, stairs, and rooms not yet occupied. I will name another dream that frequently accompanies this phase. You are in a large house, but this time you are not in the corridor. You are standing in a room with an empty chair near a window. Outside the window there is winter light on a garden path. The room is quiet, almost bare. A door behind you opens and someone enters, not as a clear person but as a familiar presence. They begin to speak, perhaps accusing, perhaps pleading, perhaps simply speaking as though the room still belongs to the old life. You do not argue. You do not answer. You look at the empty chair. The presence continues. But in the dream, the voice begins to sound farther away, as if the room itself is changing its acoustics. Then you wake. This dream is exact in its symbolism. The empty chair is the former role waiting to be reoccupied. The room is your interior after withdrawal of old functions. The winter light is consciousness without, emotional ornament. The changing acoustics signify what is completed. The old voice can still speak, but it no longer carries the same psychic force. The symbol of the empty chair deserves attention. Music, in ordinary life, an empty chair can mean loneliness. In this stage, it often means vacancy of function. A place once occupied by your old persona remains visible but uninhabited. Others may continue speaking to that absence for some time. They address the old role because they do not yet know the person who remains when the role is gone. You too may grieve that chair. It may have given you dignity, purpose, even identity. To be needed in that way can feel like meaning. Yet the psyche now refuses to let meaning be built on continual self-expenditure. This is why the social consequences of the Sophia stage are rarely dramatic in one blow. They unfold as a series of failed assumptions. Someone expects quick reassurance and receives stillness. Someone expects guilt, music, and receives no argument. Someone expects over-explanation and receives one clear sentence. Someone expects access through crisis and finds that crisis no longer opens your inner house. These are the moments in whole, I have power changes. Though I use that word cautiously, the former power others held did not usually depend on brute force. It depended on your predictability. They could reach your conscience through certain cues. They could produce your labor through timing, tone, and implication. Once your predictability is no longer organized around adaptation, that form of relational power collapses. It is important not to romanticize this collapse. It does not feel triumphant. Often it feels like loss because you begin to see how much of your life was structured by anticipatory participation. You realize you were often in conversation before anyone spoke, already preparing yourself to absorb, translate, and maintain. To stop doing this is to encounter a strange silence in your own mind. Many misread this silence as emptiness or depression. In some cases, there may indeed be depression intertwined with a process, but psychologically one must distinguish them. Depression deadens meaning. This silence reveals where borrowed meaning used to be. There is also a moral consequence here that deserves exact language. When the old contract collapses, some people around you will feel abandoned, and in a simple, the emotional sense, they are feeling is real. They did lose something, but what they lost was not necessarily love. Often they lost unexamined access. They lost a reliable conversion system in which your empathy transformed their unprocessed material into a tolerable relationship. They lost a particular arrangement of asymmetry. If they cannot grieve that honestly, they may accuse you instead. If they can, a different relation may eventually become possible. But the Sophia stage does not begin with mutual maturity. Music, it begins with exposure. In this phase, the psyche frequently produces images of animals in dreams, and the animal often marks instinct returning to rightful place. An especially common figure is a dog, but not the sentimental domestic dog of companionship. Rather a quiet animal sitting near a closed door, watchful but not agitated. You may dream of entering a dim hallway and seeing this dog lying before a door you once used constantly. It lifts its head and looks at you. It does not growl. It does not move aside. It simply remains there. You understand in the dream that the door is not to be used. The dog is instinct, no longer split off and no longer in service social adaptation. It guards not against others, but against your own regression into the former passage. When this instinct returns, boundaries cease to be moral performances and become architecture. You do not assert the boundary each time you find that the psyche no longer permits certain movements. This is what I mean when I say the shadow becomes structure. In earlier phases, anger might appear only after repeated violation, and then be immediately moralized away. You felt the anger but translated it into understanding before it could organize action. In integration, anger is no longer primarily an emotion. It becomes form. It appears as timing, as distance, as a closed door, as a sentence not spoken, as a response not sent, as a room no longer entered. Others may say, you are angry because they can sense the loss of access, but what they are sensing is often not heat, it is shape. The old self built around empathy and adaptation, often feared shape. Shape looked like cruelty because shape says no without explanation. Shape does not soften itself for consumption. Shape allows misunderstanding. For a person whose childhood or early bonds depended on preventing rupture, this can feel morally dangerous. Yet individuation requires exactly this danger. the danger of no longer organizing your life around the avoidance of others' discomfort. Music, if this is not accepted, one remains psychically divided, clear in insight, but still ruled by old obligations. That division cannot sustain itself forever. The Sophia movement emerges when the split between what you see and what you do becomes intolerable. You may have lived for years in that split, speaking of truth while living against it, understanding patterns while continuing to feed them, naming manipulation while still responding to its cues. The psyche can endure such contradiction for a long time, but eventually it exacts a price: depletion, confusion, loss of eros, inner deadness, a sense that life is happening through you but not from you. These symptoms are often treated as a motivation problem, in-depth psychology. They are frequently signs that too much psychic energy is bound in a persona that can no longer serve development. As the energy withdraws, your life acquires a different emotional climate. Some people disappear because there is no longer an unconscious yield in you. Some stay but become formal because they are learning a new relation and do not yet trust it. Some grow more honest because your non-compliance leaves them no room for the old strategies. Some become adversarial because your opacity forces them into contact with themselves. You may grieve all of this. You may feel at moments that you have become difficult to love. This is a transitional sorrow and should not be sentimentalized. What is difficult now is not loving you. What is difficult is accessing you through your former fragmentation. Music, there is another consequence, quieter and more decisive. Your relation to your own inner speech changes. The continuous self-explanation begins to diminish. You no longer narrate yourself in defense before an imaginary tribunal. You no longer conduct internal hearings about whether your silence was justified, whether your delay was kind enough, whether your unavailability can be morally excused. The tribunal loses authority. This is one of the least visible and most profound signs of integration. A person may look from the outside merely more reserved, but inwardly an entire court has closed. When that court closes, memory itself reorganizes. You begin to remember old scenes differently, not because facts change, but because your point of view is no longer located inside the role. Events you once interpreted as your failures reveal themselves as moments of coerced adaptation. Apologies you once cherished reveal their function as recurrence management. Crises you once rushed to contain reveal themselves as repeated Samoans to your old position. This retrospective clarity can be painful. It can also tempt the ego into bitterness, but bitterness is not the center of this phase. Exactness is. The Sophia Stage is not revenge upon your past. It is the removal of false centrality. Your old role was never your essence. It was a brilliant adaptation, morally adorned and socially reinforced. But it was not the organizing truth of your life. As that role loses authority, the self does not announce itself with spectacle. It appears as proportion. You begin to feel what is yours and what is not. You begin to recognize where relation ends and appropriation begins. You begin to inhabit your own timing. You begin to allow a question to remain unanswered, when the question is merely a demand wearing language. And because the social field is built so heavily, why on unspoken contracts, this proportion can seem severe. Yet severity is often just the appearance of form to a world accustomed to permeability. The world may call it distance. The psyche knows it as coherence. You begin to discover in a way that no theory can replace. That coherence has a sound. It is not loud. Music, it is not the triumphant voice of someone who has found themselves. It is quieter than that. Music, and far more unsettling. It is the absence of inner scrambling when old pressures arrive. A message comes with urgency in it, and your mind does not break into fragments. A familiar tone enters the room, half concern and half command, and your body does not descend the old staircase. A face hardens in front of you because your response did not contain the expected apology, and you do not feel the immediate need to make your own existence understandable. Coherence in this stage is not confidence. It is non-division. This is why the final movement of this psychological event cannot be described as healing in the ordinary language. Music, healing implies a restoration of what was injured. What is happening here is more exact and less sentimental, a prior organization of, your life has lost legitimacy. The center that once governed your behavior adaptation through readability, belonging through self-interruption, Contact through emotional labor has ceased to function as law. The psyche may still remember it, and others may still appeal to it, but it no longer rules. By now, you will have seen how the social field responds when this law collapses. The responses are patterned. And because they are patterned, they reveal the hidden terms of your former bonds. Someone intensifies their kindness exactly where they used to intensify pressure. Someone invokes honesty at the very moment your silence prevents their access. Someone stages confusion because confusion once drew your explanatory labor out of you. Someone becomes exquisitely polite because they can no longer.